This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
Welcome to this week's episode of Talk News TV with your host, Herman T, Laurel. We're going to be seen over half of the globe with our satellite feed. So we'll be discussing a subject that will be of interest and importance to the citizens of the world, not just of the Philippines. And the first part will be on this ongoing intensification of the tensions between the Republic of the Philippines and China. And I almost would like to call ourselves the Trios Los Panchos because we've been together on this subject several times already. But this is a very serious matter that we will be discussing. The Republic of the Philippines and China, is it heading towards collision? And with us, of course, is Mr. Chito Sta, our most famous Filipino-China watcher and analyst, who will be, by the way, with a group of people discussing how to understand China in these times, in the AIM on April 2nd. April 2nd, Asian Institute of Management. We will ask for the details later, Chito. And of course, Richard Heydarian, the most peripatetic, is that the word, writer, going all over the world. Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, Asia Times, and including GMA7, I just read. Yeah. So Richard has been with us the second time. So let's go by seniority this time. Chito, what are your impressions? Are we headed towards a collision with China? I did say before we started the show, I think there will be a clash. There may be a little bloodshed before things calm down because apparently both sides want to test each other. Am I right or am I wrong? I hope I'm wrong.
Hopefully we could avoid a military conflict. I think the Chinese objective at present is basically, in the case of Scarborough, it's to maintain their effective occupation. In the case of the Ayungin Shoal, I think it's to squeeze out, if possible, the Philippines through the so-called cabbage strategy, which is an encirclement and an entrapment strategy by deploying a superior force of Coast Guard and naval frigates there. And the recent incident is actually the first time, according to DFA, that the Chinese have tried to cut off the supply line. The only thing I want to point out is that from the Chinese perspective, what they were trying to avoid was the transport of construction materials.
That's right, yeah.
That there is suspect that the boats, the two boats in this case, were there to, they were bringing cement bars and concrete or cement and steel bars. And I don't know. I'm waiting for the Chinese to come up with their evidence. I looked at the Philippine statement. There is no denial of this. They avoided it. But what is significant, I think, is that, one, will the Chinese now cut off all the supplies? In which case, the Philippine side will have to have a plan B. Airlifting supplies is one way. Then food, certainly food. But if a boat were to bring only food, would the Chinese still stop it?
That's right.
So this is one thing we'll have to watch closely. Are the Chinese going to tow away the boat or do something to eliminate the Philippine presence on the
Yeah,
Yungin Shoal.
the sunk
This
relic
is
of a boat.
grounded,
the
the grounded
yeah.
Philippine ship, the Sierra Madre.
Which, according to the Chinese statements, the Philippine side promised to remove. Is that
Well, this is-
factual? Do we know?
I don't know. The
We don't
Philippine
know.
side only says that they acknowledge for the first time, the Philippine side, that it is a permanent, that they did it as a response
okay.
to what the Chinese did in the Mischief Reef. In order to be, serves as like a command post or an observation post of what's happening in the waters around Mischief Reef. But I think it's sort of irrelevant now. The Chinese say they will not tolerate, the Chinese goal, the Chinese objective, ultimate objective, as they declare it, is to recover what they consider theirs. From our point of view, it is ours. So this is an issue that hopefully can be resolved by the arbitration tribunal.
Okay.
But-
Well, that's a very big question. How do you resolve it through that tribunal when China obviously will not accept that?
No. Okay, then we go to this. China will not accept a legal ruling. But if you win on the legal ruling, and if the Philippines were to adopt this suggestion, you could then go on a bilateral negotiation for a political settlement on the basis of the legal ruling. Okay? So that if the Chinese says that is our indisputable sovereignty, if you have a legal ruling says it is part
Then
of
you
the
have a
Chinese
leverage.
of
You
the
have some
Philippine
leverage, yeah.
continental shelf, then you resolve that issue. You may have a deadlock, and it may ultimately come. But the point I'm trying to make is that if the Chinese were to use military force, or they may not fire a shot, they may just put a rope and tow it away. If they were to use that, they would have to pay a high political price with ASEAN.
I'm going to ask Richard what his reaction and maybe expand on that. Richard?
I couldn't agree more with Chito, as usual. Again, I think we share a lot of opinion and a lot of things. All I can say is that, well, unfortunately, we have seen nothing but the hardening of a territorial posturing on the part of China. And the same goes in reaction on the part of the Philippines, Vietnam, and also Japan. So I think we have this very toxic dynamic wherein everyone is adopting a very maximalist position, and everyone is thinking that they can outmaneuver the other side by a hard position.
But I get the impression that Vietnam is really much more flexible because they are in continuing dialogue with China. Unlike the Philippines,
Yeah.
it's really no dialogue.
Well, remember last year I took a little bit of a controversial position by saying that Aquino is recalibrating his position towards China and all. I think everything was thrown out of the window when he likened China to Nazi Germany.
Yeah,
so
but
I think he basically gave up on the trap.
Aquino doesn't know where he's going. For example, this water cannon incident. While DFA and the Department of National Defense were charging China for using the water cannon, what was Malacanang saying on the very same day? Our reports is that the fishermen are still able to go in and out, and to us it is not an issue. What is happening between Malacanang and these two cabinet portfolios that he entrusted to people? Are they his people? You know, and Richard, what?
No, I mean, you can just look at my writings. I've consistently said that there is a lack of coherence in our foreign policy, and this is nothing unique to our current administration. But all I'm saying here is that I think whatever effort that was made in the late 2013 to reach out to the top leadership of China, create a little bit of a positive dynamic. I was a little bit helpful when Xi Jinping and Aquino talked after the Yolanda crisis and all, and China a little bit step off its aid. So it created a little bit of goodwill there.
May I suggest, Richard, that maybe Aquino was recalibrating, but he is sabotaged time and time and time again, and he allows it to happen. Imagine your Department of Foreign Affairs and National Defense contradicting you, or you contradicting them as chief executive, saying everything seems to be all right from Malacanang's point of view. What's going on? A reaction from Chito and from Richard.
I think my own understanding of the situation is based on conversations with various people, is that there really are like two schools of thought within the government. The dominant one, and the one that's they're following, is that we resolve this only through a multilateral approach, through arbitration. The other approach is bilateral, and that's why you have the back channeling as well as when the decision was made to go for multilateral. What I don't know is whether it was considered what the backlash would be. And the backlash, as we know now, is that there is a political hardening. There is a virtual ban on high-level political contacts. President Aquino and Foreign
both sides.
Secretary are not welcome in China. And the invitation to the Chinese Foreign Minister, he has not, he may have accepted, but he's not coming anytime soon. So at the high level, there is virtually no political dialogue. It is all done at the USEC level and the ambassadorial
From
level.
that apparent beginnings of recalibration to this hardening, what has happened in between? Is it the U.S. bases or U.S. re-entry talks in the Philippines? It seems that this hardening...
That is a factor.
Yeah.
I mean, behind these two approaches, though, I think there is some unanimity within the government that it's like you bring in a big power because you feel threatened by a rising power. So that is the rationale behind it. The only problem with that thinking is that it also increases your risk factor. It may deter the Chinese for a while. But if you start increasing the number of U.S. forces here, and because of the U.S. policy of neither confirming or denying whether they're carrying nuclear weapons, it is really hard to conceive that those nuclear submarines will not carry any, which would be aimed at China. Therefore, the Chinese missiles are aimed at Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. The Philippines will now enter the targeting radar.
Yeah.
So this increases our own risk. So as long as the political leadership is aware of that this is not a cost-free move.
So what you're saying, and Richard, maybe you can add to this, prior to all these, the Philippines would not have been a target.
We are, okay.
Hindi, gusto ko lang maintindihan ng audience natin, ng mga crew natin dito. Hindi tayo target noon.
Nagka-survey sa China, threat perception, Philippines, virtually zero. 1%
Hindi
at
kalaban
most.
ng Pilipinas.
They don't perceive us as a threat. But they perceive the U.S.
as a
the top threat. Secondly, Japan.
Because that's what I've been saying. Our definition of our relations to China and the U.S. should take that into consideration, that we should not be a sacrificial lamb as we have experienced in the past. Richard?
Well, I mean, maybe the Chinese don't see us as a threat, but if you look at the level of animosity that the Chinese have towards other countries, we're number 2 to the Japanese. I don't think that's a good thing. So that means that it makes it very difficult for the Xi Jinping administration to make any compromise towards us. So now that
are you saying, Richard, it is also because Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is responding to popular sentiment about the Philippines inside China?
Yeah, I mean, let's be very honest. Communism is basically dead. I mean, if there's any efficient capitalism we have around, it's Singapore and China model, and the Americans are trying to actually copy that in one way or another. So what we have in replacement for that ideological vacuum is popular nationalism, and the Japanese and all are actually following through. So this is a new phenomenon, and I think for the Chinese government, it's good politics to play hard on the international front. And this has also to do with the fact that China is facing very difficult economic reforms. Many were expecting that this year China will accept a slowing down of its economic growth. But if you look at Li Keqiang's statements in the NPC, the latest National People's Congress, he said that we will stick to a 7.5% growth. If you talk to all reasonable economists and statisticians in China, they say that we have to look at 7% or 6.5%. So that means that they're not a very confident country, leadership when it comes to the economic reforms. How do you compensate like that? You play hard line on the international front. And unfortunately, we'll be one of the victims of that. Now, the elephant in the room is obviously the United States. You see, in the late 2013, the United States was a little bit ambivalent. I think the Obama administration was very focused on dealing with the crisis in the Middle East, Syria and particularly Iran. And in November, there was an important nuclear deal there. But if you look at it since January, since China imposed a new maritime measure in Hainan, which is the second amendment to its Hainan maritime rule, you see an escalation in the rhetoric of the State Department. The State Department is really being always condemning the movement of China. And in February, you saw the top officials from the U.S. State Department basically dropping the neutrality of the United States. If you look at it, the U.S. always said that, no, we don't take a position on the sovereignty of disputed features. We are only concerned with freedom of navigation. But most recently, you see the top officials in the U.S. State Department saying that the 9-dash line has no basis in international law. So in effect, U.S. is taking side with the Philippines, and in effect, if Vietnam and Japan also file a case and question Chinese claims, U.S. is taking side with them. So I think this gave an idea to the Aquino administration that maybe you guys in the DFA were right all the time. Maybe we can rely on the Americans, and maybe we can really reason out with the Chinese. So I think the two school of thought here is this. One school of thought is, let's rely on the Americans and the Japanese. We have no choice because you can't reason out with the Chinese. They're going to be hardening their position, and the cabinet strategies not only going to be maritime, you're going to also have a new ADIZ most likely within the year.
Well, it only leads to the same point. Malacanang has schizophrenia on these issues. It cannot decide. Is it going to be this way or that way?
Well, I think basically the decision has been made.
Which is
to
yeah,
multilateral, push through with arbitration.
Mm-hmm.
There is some argument on whether there should be some form of bilateral. Because what are you going to do during this year while the whole thing is being arbitrated? You're not going to talk to each other. And what happens?
Is the process in ITLOS expected to be
at least 6 months
extended?
to a year?
That's a short time.
That's relatively short. It could be longer if you add more.
Because
more
if the
details
strategy is to get a positive decision from ITLOS for the Philippines, which is very likely because of the composition of the ITLOS, but then to bring it to a bilateral discussion, then that's a positive direction, I think. Richard, what do you think?
The multilateral part, there's some very important development right now. I think we are kind of giving up on the ASEAN as ASEAN itself. Yes, Myanmar has been a little bit more vocal about the necessity to deal with the South China Sea disputes. But if you look at the latest meeting of experts group on the DOC in Singapore, practically nothing really came out
DOC is the conduct.
Declaration of the Conduct of Parties.
Okay.
And that's implementation of the DOC. We're not even talking about a legally binding code of conduct. But one important development within the ASEAN is that now Malaysia and Malaysia, Vietnam, and Philippines are coming together. For me, Vietnam coming with the Philippines is something normal, expected.
That's right. Yeah.
Brunei not coming is also expected because Brunei feels it's just really too small to really play an important role, and the Chinese have been really in an effective charm offensive mode towards them. But Malaysia coming in and trying to push for an institutionalized coordination of positions among
on the Declaration of Conduct.
and on the South China Sea positioning, I think it's very important, and it had to do something with Malaysia's growing worry of increased frequencies in Chinese military exercises near Malaysian-controlled territories.
Okay.
So now the Malaysians are also feeling the heat a little bit, and they have been actually pushing for almost every month, let's talk Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Let's come and talk together. And within the ASEAN, let's create a lobby to push the ASEAN to push for a COC. And most recently, by the way, the president of Vietnam was in Japan. I used to always defend that Vietnam was very low profile, but even Vietnam a little bit is giving up the low profile, going for the next level. So I think there's a feeling that this so-called security diamond, a counter alliance against China, is already in the formation mode, and they're happy that Malaysia is coming in. And if you look at the statements between President Sang and Abe, I mean, they have been sounding very strong on stepping up their military relationship. I mean, I've had Japanese students, and I had some sort of focus group discussion. It's almost unanimous among the Japanese people that China is a threat. So I think if I'm Abe, I'll say that 6 months to 1 year down the road, especially if something big happens in Senkaku, Diaoyu, I can get the 50% plus one for a referendum on revising the Japanese constitution. So I think everyone is optimistic that the Obama administration is in this game. Whether it has a wherewithal is a different question. But they're in this game politically, and the Japanese are very close to revising the constitution.
Any perceived reaction from the Chinese side on these developments?
No, I think the Chinese face two problems. One is their own conduct. Okay? They have like blinders, which leads them to a tunnel vision when it comes to the defense of core interests of state sovereignty. And this is what is causing, which is undermining the other aspect, which is they have this good neighborly policy that they want to implement that will attract or integrate or unite with ASEAN. But that won't work. You can't do both at the same time. And I think unless they realize this, you would really find it's like the makings of a bipolar situation in the Asia-Pacific region. A pro-US, a US-Japan alliance, including the Philippines. And then you have China and some of the countries like Laos, Cambodia, North Korea, perhaps, and the two blocks, you know. But the Chinese, if they, obviously they don't want a war breaking out between them and the U.S. Not now, because of their priority on economic development. So, at most, if you look at it, after the Yasukuni visit, I thought the Chinese streets would be filled with demonstrations against Abe, or that the Chinese could even try to take up an island because Yasukuni was such a sensitive. What did they do? They instead went on a letter-writing campaign all over the world. So it seems to me they're trying to diffuse. What provoked this, I think, was the very direct statement from the U.S. that although we don't take a position on the sovereignty of the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands, we recognize that it's under Japanese administration, and meaning if something were to happen and it's taken away from Japan, the Mutual Defense Treaty would come into effect. So because of this, I think the Chinese have backed off a bit. Okay, although they're still trying to show their cat and mouse strategy of pushing the envelope. But I think the basic approach is push the envelope short of war, and then concentrate on economic development, and the same with us. Push the envelope as far as you can, defense of our strategy, short of an outright war. But I don't exclude a short, limited, possible military conflict arising out of miscalculation.
I was just about to say that. Are you discounting the short outburst of...
No, okay. I mentioned the cabbage strategy. What the Chinese are looking out to is for us, the Philippine side, to make a mistake. We fire the first shot. We try to arrest the fisherman. Or we bump into their Coast Guard. But the Chinese are very careful. Remember the water cannon incident.
Yeah, quickly.
It is of course a concern that they are disrupting.
Were they water cannons or water hoses?
Whatever it is not bullets.
Yes.
It is water.
Yeah.
So this is a tactic used by the Japanese against the Taiwanese fishermen. So what I'm saying is that you could still see the frame of mind. They're trying to keep it at a certain threshold. They don't want to cross the military line.
I also got feedback from the fishing community that they were not fishermen. As you were saying, the Chinese side also say that. So
two things. I mean, first of all, I think the conflicting statements on the fishing incident just emphasizes what I and a lot of my friends across the Asia Pacific have been saying, that you need a neutral international body that monitors events there and verifies what happens. Because in the vacuum of information, you only give, fuel to the most hardline media to just step up and escalate the situation.
That internationalizes the issue with the Chinese.
Well, not all internationalization is bad, and I think Chinese will welcome certain forms of internationalizations that will de-escalate the situation. I completely agree with Chito, and I've been saying that let's not look at the Chinese leadership as a monolithic force. There is a pragmatic streak even within Xi Jinping. The fact that he prevented major protests coming out after the Yasukuni visit of Abe shows that he wants to control the situation. And China, by the way, doesn't only see itself as a rising power. I think they see themselves as a status quo power that deserves respect. That is why, if you look at it, Xi Jinping, in his planned visit to Germany, wanted to go to the Holocaust museum to emphasize that we Chinese were against, and he was actually also trying to throw a jibe at Aquino by saying that, by the way, we were allies, we were among the allies against Nazi Germany.
That's right.
So there is a sensitivity to the image of China. And I think what you see right now is that here and there you hear some Chinese scholars saying that, I'm not maybe that sure that the way we are going forward is the best way forward. So I think there's a hope among a lot of us outside of China is that now that China is feeling the heat, that you have like sort of a counter-alliance forming, the pragmatics will, speak up. I don't think this is going to really work. And let's face it, the hardline guys in the PLA Navy still do not have the hard power to match the Americans, especially if the Americans have the support of the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Vietnamese.
Okay, we're now going to take a break, and a bit of this discussion might spill over to the second part. But our second part, hang on, will be about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa versus the West. This is not to create a new Cold War attitude, but rather just to frame an issue for our discussion later. So hang on. Kulang.